Hello, this is Sabrina Moreland from the Walter State Library, and I've created a video that explains how to cite sources for literary analysis. And so a few things to keep in mind when you're writing about literature is that you will be stating your own ideas about the text. So if it's a poem or a short story or play, you're going to start off with your interpretations, what you see, and what you think about that piece of literature. Then you're going to provide textual evidence, either in the form of a primary source or a secondary source. So for the primary source, you're going to be quoting or paraphrasing from the text you're studying, so that piece of literature. And when you use secondary sources, you're going to be doing research and gathering literary criticism that supports what you're saying as well. And then lastly, you're going to provide some discussion on how all of that ties together, and you're going to explain your interpretation and how your textual evidence backs up your main ideas. So if we were writing about the theme of terror in Poe's short story, The Masque of the Red Death, then I would be able to find information in the short story that supports this idea of the theme, and then I'd be able to go out and maybe look in the databases and find literary criticism. So these are just a couple very, very broad statements that are my ideas. If I were taking a class in real life, I would narrow this down more. So if I was just saying in general that Poe's stories and poems contain the theme of terror or fear, I would be able to find articles that support that. And I'd be able to show that in his different works. And specifically for The Masque of the Red Death, if I said that the guests, so the people who are attending the masquerade in this story, and the reader are both feeling this sort of perpetual sense of terror, then I would be able to support that in my textual evidence as far as the primary source goes, and if any articles that I find as well. So in the text, if I were going to use the primary source of The Masque of the Red Death, this could be an example of both an in-text and parenthetical citation. Now, these are both the same information. They're just written a little differently. For an in-text citation, you include the author's name in the text. So in this case, Poe informs the reader that the presence of the Red Death causes feelings of, quote, terror, horror, and of disgust, end quote. So this is directly from Masque of the Red Death in a textbook on page 433. I would be saying the same thing in the parenthetical citation. It's just in this case, I start off with the crowd acknowledges and so forth, and I would include Poe, page 433, in my parenthetical citation. Quoting from the story, quoting from The Masque of the Red Death, and showing that there is this idea of terror and horror that I mentioned in my own ideas is backing up what I'm saying. I'm not summarizing the story, but I'm taking a very specific part of the text and using it to support what I'm saying about my theme or metaphor or character, whatever it is I'm studying in this class, and whatever it is I'm trying to prove is an element in the story. For the secondary source, here's another in-text and parenthetical citation of the same information. If I consulted an article of literary criticism, I could say in the parenthetical, Poe utilizes terror and horror in his works, quote, to teach his reader to navigate the tempest of the human condition, end quote. And then Garrison 146. So Garrison's the author of the secondary source, and this quote is from page 146. And so that same information is in my in-text citation, but I lead in, I have a signal phrase there. So according to Garrison, etc. So this is showing that a scholar, and this piece of literary criticism, this article, is backing up what I'm saying about all of these elements of terror and horror in Poe's writing. And so remember, if you're doing literary criticism and literary analysis, you may be using articles and broad statements about Poe that back up what you're saying on a certain story or poem. So this all supports it, and I've led into both these quotes. I'm not just, using a dropped quote. because we want to avoid dumped or dropped quotes. So we want the quote to have a signal phrase and to be explained. We don't want it to just randomly appear without an introduction. So you have to use your own words and your own thoughts to introduce a quote. And we don't want it to be an unwelcome disruption, and we don't want it to be a standalone statement. So anytime you quote from the primary source or the secondary source, you need to explain its context. And so when you're introducing quotes in literature, for literature, you can do it in different ways. You can have an introducing clause and then the quotation, and that's really what I've done in both the examples I've given you. I've had my own words and my own explanation introducing what's going to happen in the rest of my sentence, and then I have the quote. You can have an assertion of your own words, and then you can use a colon to introduce the quote, and then you can have your own words that has the material sort of worked in, so sort of blended in the middle. So there's different ways of inserting and using quotes from the texts. And so some examples of that. So for example, we were using The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and we were doing a character examination. These are different ways we could do that, and I wanted to get this video out quickly, so I did not come up with these examples. So I did come up with all the Poe examples. But so the first one, Gatsby is not to be regarded as a personal failure because, quote, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. 176, comma, according to Nick. So a character in the story has said this about Gatsby's character. And so the others show there's the use of the colon in the second example. Fitzgerald gives Nick a muted tribute to the hero, so talking about the character there, and that's a great sort of example of how the character of Gatsby is being analyzed in the story in the primary source. And then the third one for Nick, who remarks that Gatsby turned out all right, the hero deserves respect but perhaps does not inspire great admiration. So this is examples from the text that are supporting what's being said about Gatsby's character. So different ways of writing them, but it's not just a summary. We're not just summarizing what happened in the story. We're finding very specific examples to support what we're saying, to support our own ideas. Some more examples. The two Thoreau, so from Walden, his work, those are not my examples, but if we were thinking about proving metaphor and the use of metaphor in writing, some examples could be Thoreau ends his essay with a metaphor. Time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. That is a metaphor. It's saying time is the stream. Thoreau suggests the consequences of making ourselves slaves to progress when he says that we do not ride on the railroad, it rides upon us. So that's another metaphor, right? This is a literal example of a metaphor from his work. Again, it's not a summary. I'm providing an example. And then this one is from The Masque of the Red Death. And so Prince Prospero guides the masqueraders through the 7 rooms, comparing his guests to, quote, a multitude of dreams. Poe 664. And so again, I'm taking the primary source, the poem, the story, the novel, the play, whatever it is, and I am extracting these examples of these elements. And just a couple more examples. I did not create the foreshadowing one, but in the first description of the bedroom, Gilman foreshadows the role the wallpaper will play in the narrator's mental breakdown when she says, quote, I never saw a worse paper in my life, end quote. And so that phrase from the story is reinforcing and showing foreshadowing for what happens later in the play. So that's an example of foreshadowing. And then personification from Masque of the Red Death. A sense of urgency is prevalent throughout the story. The clock in the black chamber chimes every hour with its brazen lungs as a reminder to everyone of the passage of time. So brazen lungs, giving lungs to the clock, is an example of personification taken from the story. These are just some references I consulted. If you're interested, you can look at those links, and they all lead to some really detailed examples of how to use quotes in literary analysis. I hope this helps and adds to what your instructor has said about this topic. Feel free to contact me or another librarian if you have any questions, and thanks for listening.